Okay, welcome everyone to today's Spatial Analytics and Data, or SAD seminar. Today, my co-host Levi Wolf and I are delighted to welcome Dr. Steve Farber for a talk on mobilizing justice towards evidence-based transportation equity policy. Steve Farber is a transportation geographer and spatial analyst in the Department of Human Geography at the University of Toronto in Canada. His research investigates the social and economic outcomes of transportation and land use decision-making in urban areas, and he's currently working on projects related to the distributional aspects of transit accessibility, personal mobility, and participation in the activities of daily life. Dr. Farber has authored more than 40 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and he's on the editorial boards of 3 international geography and transportation journals, including Geographical Analysis. And he also chairs the Social and Economic Factors Committee at the Transportation Research Board, or TRB, one of the US National Academies of Science. Before I hand the floor over to our speaker, just a few quick logistical pointers. I won't point you to the emergency exits, but I will tell you how to put your questions and comments into the Zoom room for us to take at the end of the talk. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a Q&A option. If you use that to leave your questions and comments, that's where we'll pick them up as soon as we're done with the formal part of the seminar. And with that, I turn it over to you, Dr. Farber.
Thanks, Rachel. And thanks both to you and Levi for extending this invitation. Really excited about the SAD seminar series. And it's a huge feather in my cap that I got invited to speak to you all. So thanks so much for that. I hope that the presentation today is interesting. I'll give you a bit of a high-level overview, and then I'll just jump into it. I'm going to start with an introduction to the area of transportation equity, and going back to some first principles and covering some of the theoretical underpinnings of that. Following that, I'm going to go into some empirical work that we conducted with our local transportation authority in the Greater Toronto area. And I'll show how we used spatial analysis and different types of models to investigate the social equity benefits associated with transportation infrastructure investments. And following that, that'll kind of lead us into a description of a really large research project that I'm leading called Mobilizing Justice. And I'll give you an introduction to all of the great research that we're conducting there and why we're doing it and what's to come from that big program of research over the next few years. So I like to start with a bit of a rhetorical question around what should transportation planners focus on? Transportation is so integral to so many different aspects of the environment, society, the economy, the built form. And planners are really pulled in all sorts of different directions. Some traditional directions, including planning for mobility and speed and freight, and economic and urban development. More recently, a lot of attention being paid on using new data sources for planning, and also how to plan for smarter mobility technologies, connected autonomous vehicles and ride-hailing apps and mobility as a service and so on. And all the while, there's been this persistent attention also on reducing externalities. So the pollution, health, climate externalities associated with transportation. And I like to ask in all of this, what about people in transportation planning? And I'd like to remind the audience that enabling the freedom to participate in the activities of daily life is really one of the key fundamental purposes of the transportation system. And despite this being not the only fundamental purpose, but one of the main fundamental purposes, it's really received very little attention in the planning practice, in transportation planning practice. We really don't measure activity participation. We don't measure very well how easily different people can participate in different types of activities. And instead, we kind of look at proxies like increasing mobility, making it easier for people to travel. And we manage externalities, trying to create a system that's more environmentally friendly or sustainable. But we don't actually plan towards this core objective. And I think that's a huge problem. We don't really know how to achieve that participation objective because we don't measure it or plan for it. And even if we were doing this, we wouldn't really know how to do this in a fair or just way, right? Who should be, whose participation should we be prioritizing, right? Or how do we prioritize how we make it easier for different people to participate in those different activities? So what's fair in this case? And that really leads us to this whole concept of transportation equity, which is about the fairness of the distribution of both the costs and the benefits of the transportation system. And there's been a lot of research in the last 20 years on transportation equity, but it really boils down to 4 fundamental questions. All of the research in transportation equity kind of touches on these dimensions. So what are the costs that we'd like to measure in the transportation system? What are the benefits and how do we measure those? What are the distributive population groups? Are we comparing rich versus poor, citizens versus asylum seekers, white versus black? How are we going to divide that population into different distributive groups? And then once we've done that division of the population, how are we going to decide what's a fair distribution of the costs or benefits, right? And there's been quite a lot of work kind of bridging philosophy, the philosophy of distributive justice into the transportation realm. And the 2 resources that I really turn to for this are Karl Martins, who's a transportation planner at the Technion University in Israel, although traditionally or historically a Dutch planner. And Karl, in his 2016 book, Transport Justice, really develops these sufficientarian arguments that say, in order to achieve a just transportation system, we have to make sure that there's a minimum level of transport supply, or the benefits are distributed in such a way that every group in the city, every person in the city, at least receives that minimum standard. So I like to think of the 20-minute city or the 15-minute city, as a planning concept that gets towards hitting a minimum standard. What do we want to achieve? We want to make sure that everyone, regardless of where they can live, can reach some key set of amenities within a reasonable travel time, say 15 minutes, and without the use of a car, right? The other kind of main influencer, I think, in this space is Karen Lucas. And Karen Lucas comes at it with a different philosophy, really stemming from a capability approach to justice. And this gets tied into the transportation and social exclusion framework, which I'll explain on the next slide. But the idea here is we want to focus on ensuring that all people, regardless of their kind of natural endowments, or regardless of their wealth and how, who they are and their position in society, are able to participate in all the activities deemed normal for society, whatever that means: going to the shops, getting a job, employment, education, healthcare trips. And the focus then is on relieving those barriers that are stopping people from from having those core capabilities met. And this is really demonstrated nicely in the transport and social exclusion framework. This is drawn from Karen's 2012 article. The idea here is people who are, and the language around disadvantage has changed in transportation equity. We don't like to speak about disadvantages as much anymore. We try to use asset-based language, so thinking about not people being disadvantaged, but kind of society marginalizing people based on who they are, right? So we call this social disadvantage, but we could think about people who are marginalized by the social and political structures and economic structures in society. So those might be people who aren't earning a lot of money, who don't have a high education level. These kind of social marginalization, when that intersects with what I'll call transport marginalization, living in places where public transit isn't safe, affordable, convenient, or where other modes of transportation aren't safe, affordable, and convenient, whether it's walking or cycling or driving. But when transport disadvantage and social disadvantage combine, we talk about that being transport poverty. And the idea here also is that someone can be transport disadvantaged, but still have money and social capital and other kind of social advantages that allow them to allow them to pay to overcome that transport disadvantage. So my grandmother, who's an elderly woman, is severely transport disadvantaged, but she has enough money from her savings and her pension, and my parents help her out to overcome those transportation barriers. She can hire a taxi anytime she needs to in order to overcome, right, that transport disadvantage of not being able to drive and living in a place with poor transit. But for those who can't overcome that disadvantage, they really get, we think of this as being kind of trapped in this state of transport poverty. And the implication of being in transport poverty is that it's just simply harder to reach vital destinations of everyday life. And if it's harder to reach all of these places, we think we should see then suppressed participation in all of the activities that take place at all of these different destinations around the city. And if that is occurring over a long period of time for a person, that's when we start talking about social exclusion and this kind of feedback loop and that kind of further entrenching both those social and transport marginalization, right? And kind of getting stuck in this long-term trap of social exclusion. But in the shorter term, we can also think about this characteristic of inaccessibility just resulting in negative life outcomes, not necessarily talking about this long-term condition of social exclusion, but just thinking about a reduction in well-being and quality of life, perhaps worse economic outcomes, worse health outcomes, and so on, or lower levels of social capital. So these can be kind of more cross-sectional or instantaneous or shorter term than in nature than social exclusion at large, which really talks about the long-term entrenchment of this. Both are extremely important. So transportation equity, I say, has really been in the last decade has really been driven a lot by Karl Martins and Karen Lucas's work, but there are other precedents that have entered in, especially in the US case. There's a big precedent in thinking about transportation equity through the lens of civil rights and environmental justice. And these were a series of federal laws that were implemented to reduce the amount of discrimination against originally African Americans, and then that's been extended to other minority groups and economic groups. The idea is to reduce the amount of discrimination in federal spending, right, on different population groups. And because a lot of transportation in the US is funded through federal spending, especially capital investments in new infrastructure, the idea here is that the civil rights and environmental justice laws are in play, right? And agencies need to prove that they're not discriminating against different different social groups. And it's more or less been in place for a long time in the US. And in fact, in many ways, kind of the justice lens to transportation has been around in the US much longer than it has in other countries, much longer than it has in Canada, and I know for most of Europe as well. And that's something that's quite interesting because we don't think of the US always as being kind of the one of the places where more progressive transportation policy originates. But in fact, it is. But there are kind of issues with those legislations, and most experts will say that the law sets the bar too low, and that in order to really be guilty of discrimination in spending in transit in the US, it has to be proven in court that you've purposefully allocated your resources in a way that privileges kind of white Americans and disadvantages other minority groups. And that's often hard to prove. So the bar is set too low. And when we speak to experts, a lot of people think that, we need to raise the bar because most transit authorities are very resource constrained, and they will reduce their workload to the kind of the minimum level that allows them to move forward with their operations. And that's not true for all transit authorities across the country, especially the more resourced ones have the ability to go above and beyond these minimum thresholds, but the thresholds seem a bit low. The other kind of area where a lot of thinking about transportation equity has been influenced is coming from tax law and thinking about kind of equity versus equality and the differences between vertical equity and horizontal equity. And I think a lot of you have seen these figures of different forms. It's probably supposed to be a soccer pitch in the UK, not a baseball diamond. But if you can't tell from the picture, these are people trying to watch a sports game in the United States. And the idea is, one version of equity, right, that we call equality, is to give everyone the same support. And the other version is equity, where we give each person the support that they need in order to achieve what they're trying to achieve in life. In this case, watch the ball game. And that's really what we call vertical equity in the transportation space as well. Now, these kind of names come from taxation policy, but they apply fairly well across the board in transportation as well. Okay, so why all of this big introduction? Why does this matter? And from the Canadian perspective, I think what I'm going to say about Canada is true for most OECD countries, or kind of developed countries, and then in the rest of the world, it's even more pressing than than the story for the developed world. But in most cities around the world, we are seeing increases in inequality. So we've got these growing gaps between rich and poor in most places in the world right now. And within cities in particular, we're seeing a reorientation of where wealthier people and low-income people are moving and living. And in the Toronto case, we actually see the growth of poverty occurring in what we call our inner suburbs. So this is the city of Toronto. This brown area is what we call our inner suburbs. These are kind of post-war automobile-oriented suburbs that were originally built for the middle class, but over the last 50 years of urban kind of social dynamics, we see that a lot of the housing stock is being degraded in quality. A lot of the original rental towers built in these areas for young 1970s, the equivalent of yuppies of today, right, are now being lived in by large immigrant families without cars and so on. And at the same time, we see a lot of the wealth concentrating in the city again. And this really creates kind of a perfect storm from a transport poverty perspective, because we have growing numbers of transport poor, and we have quite large numbers of transport poor across all of the big cities in Canada. So just in this table over here kind of talks about how many people, low-income people, are living in the lowest levels of accessibility in the different cities in Canada, set at 2 different thresholds on a scale that goes from 0 to 1. So if we look at, you know, a score of 0.1 in the Toronto area alone, we have 640,000 low-income people living in low-income families, living in amongst the lowest levels of transit-served neighborhoods in the country. Okay, and as you know, as a country overall, we've got 1.3 million people living under these conditions, and that's a lot of people being at risk of transport poverty or at risk of transport and social exclusion. And these numbers are, you know, not dissimilar to other numbers we see for other countries in the world. So I'm going to now move into this next part, which goes into some empirical research that we conducted to kind of assess the state of transport poverty in the Greater Toronto area, and also to really try to model that relationship between accessibility and the ease of reaching destinations and people's participation in daily activities. So this was a research project that we did in partnership with Metrolinx. They're the planning authority for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, the GTHA. And we really kind of make use of 2 main data sets in this project. The first is a data set that we created, so an accessibility data set that allows us to measure the ease with which people can reach destinations via the transit network. And I'm sorry, we do this for both transit and walking and car trips. So we have these different measures of accessibility. We are using an access to jobs measure for all of those modes, not because this is all about employment, but the research shows us that when we are looking for kind of a general purpose proxy for access to all sorts of destinations, jobs, access to jobs serves as a very good proxy. Access to jobs is like more than 95% correlated with access to all activity destinations overall. The other data set that we use is a travel survey called the Transportation Tomorrow Survey. This survey includes a 1-day travel diary of several 100,000 people across the region. It's actually the world's largest non-national household travel survey. So that's the largest regional household travel survey in the world, very high sample. And what we can do is look at those daily travel diaries and estimate counts of, or count, not estimate, but we can count how many trips people participated in, what kind of activities were on the kind of destination side of those trips, and a differentiation between what we would call mandatory trips like going to work and school versus discretionary trips like going to the gym or going to the bar or going shopping. So for every person in our survey, we now have these 3 measures: the number of trips they conducted, the counts of out-of-home activities they participated in, and of those, the count of discretionary activities. And this diagram just kind of shows a depiction of those different daily itineraries and how we extract those counts. This is and I mean, the overall thinking behind what we're doing here is we want to test the hypothesis that those with higher levels of accessibility actually perform more out-of-home activities. Okay, and specifically those living in transport poverty, we hypothesize are performing less activities. This is a map of accessibility with income overlaid as these dot maps on the dots on top. So every dot here represents 50 people living below the poverty line. And what we see in a region like Toronto is about half of the low-income population is living in the inner core still, all right? They haven't been gentrified out of the core. But a full half of the population living in poverty is outside of those transit-served areas. And we conducted some spatial analysis on the participation rates of different people over space and did some clustering. And we ended up finding these significant clusters of suppressed participation in daily activities. So in red is where we see these concentrations of people who are performing low numbers of activities each day. And anecdotally from the map, we can see that this is at the intersection of poverty and accessibility, of low accessibility and high poverty. If you remember, a full half of the low-income population lives in the inner city here in really walkable transit-served areas. We see relatively few concentrations of suppressed activity participation there, given how high the poverty levels are. Whereas out in the suburbs where you do see poverty, that's where you see that suppression in activity participation. So this next plot shows that for different kind of segments of the population based on income and car ownership, we see that there's a big gap in participation between different population groups out here in these lower levels of accessibility. But as people are living in higher and higher access neighborhoods where transit services and urban form allows greater ease of access to destinations, we actually see the differences in participation levels starting to evaporate. And the idea here is that with continued investment in accessibility and retrofitting of urban form in these lower density suburbs, we might actually have some policies that can reduce these gaps in participation between rich and poor, and also between folks who own cars and don't own cars. So given kind of the maps and some of the descriptive statistics, the next step is we estimated a whole lot of regression models to look at this. And these are just the high level results. We had a lot of other controls in our model that come from either that cover kind of the urban form of the neighborhoods or the socioeconomic status of the individuals. And these are individual based models coming off of the household travel survey, right? So what we first wanted to do was get a better understanding of the functional form, the relationship between accessibility and participation in daily activities, okay? And we tested linear, quadratic, and sigmoidal functional forms, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But accessibility was significant in all cases in promoting participation. Income and car ownership were even more important than accessibility, but accessibility was important. And in all cases, we see more participation with access, more participation with income, and more participation with increasing car ownership. We wanted to know how those relationships varied by income and car ownership level, though. How does accessibility impact a wealthy car owner versus how does accessibility impact a low-income carless household? We would expect those relationships to be different. So we stratified our sample into 25 groups based on income levels and car ownership. Vehicles per adult is the car ownership variable. And we reran all of our models on those subsamples. Like I said, we have hundreds of thousands of responses, so doing stratification was possible. We could have done this using interaction terms and random effects and things like that, but we just decided to keep it simple with stratification. And what we see is the relationship between accessibility and participation matters for quite a few groups, but the relationships are strongest in those zero car households. And that makes sense. right? Households without cars really depend on other forms of accessibility to make it easy to participate in activities. But it's also more true for the lower income carless households than it is for the wealthier households, with the idea there that the wealthier households can kind of buy their way out of less automobile ownership in order to achieve those higher levels of participation. What does that mean? They're either have no barriers to paying expensive transit fares, so they're paying for transit no matter what, even if it's not so attractive, or it means they're paying for taxis or Ubers, or they're getting rides from their friends and family, because with wealth also comes more social capital typically as well. Okay, so why the sigmoid? Where do we expect accessibility to really influence? We can think about the high end of accessibility first. And if we increase accessibility in areas of the city where there's already high amounts of accessibility, we don't really expect to see a big return in activity participation. We might see, a reduction in travel times, but at these high-end neighborhoods where accessibility is already high, the lack of accessibility isn't a barrier for participation. So people kind of are already participating in the levels that they want, that they're already achieving their highest levels of desired activity participation, and giving them more transportation resource doesn't help bump the rates up. And at the same time, if we look all the way out in the most desertous areas, of the region where there's no transit, again, bringing a new bus, you think that would have a tremendous impact, but in fact, people living there don't respond very highly to a single new bus being invested in their neighborhood. Increasing accessibility there doesn't really change patterns all that much either. Most people living there either have cars, or they've really figured out they need a lot more investment in transit to actually increase participation levels. But on the, conversely, we actually find that it's in these middle areas of accessibility where transit is a viable option, but it's not at a high enough level that it's really an attractive option, that we see that increasing transit results in a high return in activity participation. It does a good job of unlocking people's ability to participate in daily activities. So if we take all of our model results and take into consideration the sigmoidal shape of the accessibility participation relationship, we can then make these lovely maps that show us how much participation we expect to see as a return in investment on transportation investments, and where we expect to see those. So we've kind of, we're looking now at places overall where activity levels are a bit lower. So everything else is kind of whited out for now. And we see that investments in transit tend to have the biggest returns in these lower income inner suburban areas, kind of like our theory says, right? And I think that this really follows along from our social exclusion framework as well, thinking about where people really are in transport poverty and where an increase in accessibility is likely to result in unlocking people's opportunity to participate. So I need to take one step back, because I didn't really describe one of the main reasons why we were doing this. The idea behind this actually is that Metrolinx wanted to think about new ways to quantify the benefits of transportation investments that would result in a more equitable transportation planning process. And the idea here is, by trying to quantify the benefits of an investment as how much it unlocks suppressed demand for transportation really allows us to focus investments where A, there is suppressed demand, and B, where that suppressed demand is going to be reduced through an investment in transit. And in doing so, it kind of has an economic benefit that fits into their business cases. How much is it worth to unlock all of this suppressed demand? And because it's mostly marginalized groups who have suppressed demand, we also, by unlocking that suppressed demand, we're also improving the well-being specifically of marginalized groups. So we were exploring alternatives there and thinking about how we can start using this unlocking of suppressed demand as a new metric to guide our transportation cost benefits analysis. Thinking about what cities are growing, incomes are polarizing, and poverty is suburbanizing. So it's leading to big increases in risks of social exclusion, and we are seeing evidence of suppressed demand in activity participation, where low incomes intersect with low access. And at the same time, our models, and these are cross-sectional models, so it's not, before and after studies, but that's kind of the future of where we're going. But we at least can see in our models that cross-sectionally, lower income families who are living in higher levels of access neighborhoods are doing better than those living in lower access neighborhoods, where we're seeing increased levels of participation where the transportation system allows it. And that does lead us to believe that by making investments in areas where there's suppressed demand, we would see those benefits to occur. So this is an example of research that helps us kind of substantiate and support changes in policy, right, that are based on evidence. And it's not rocket science what we did. I like to say it's transit science, not rocket science. It's not so innovative. However, transportation planning is quite behind still in terms of making use of new conceptualizations of the costs and benefits of the transportation system, and shifting the ways in which we prioritize projects. We're very slow at doing that. So I do think that this research is fundamental in actually moving the practice forward, despite it maybe scientifically being it's solid but not filled with tons and tons of innovative things. Okay, so where does that leads us? I'll wrap up with a quick description of Mobilizing Justice. It's I think it's a very exciting development in Canada, but also hopefully will have some impact around the world as well. So Mobilizing Justice is a new 5-year partnership. And we're a partnership of academics, municipalities, provinces, transit authorities, federal government agencies, private sector transportation firms. And we are trying to coordinate and focus the transportation sector across all of these different kind of domains on, focus our attention on the accessibility and participation challenges and lived experiences of marginalized groups across the country. And we're really leveraging this intersectoral and partnered structure to ensure that the research that the academics conduct are really kind of reflect the challenges and goals that are stated by our partners in the project, that we have really clear pathways also from research to practice, and through community partnerships also kind of that our research helps empower community groups who have been advocating for more justice in the transportation space long before kind of academia and the state stepped in to say, hey, you know what, this matters actually. So very, very excited, and this is just a snapshot of one of our kind of all hands meetings that we had at the project initiation phase. The project itself is split up into 6 main research activities. The first is we're conducting the first ever national survey of transport poverty. We're going to focus on 20,000 Canadians on low incomes. And for the first time, a transportation survey, rather than focusing on all the things that a person did using a trip diary approach, we really want to get a more nuanced understanding on what people want to be doing, what the perceived constraints are, how this is impacting people's well-being, self-stated kind of expressions of suppressed demand for participation in daily life activities. And it's kind of the untravel survey. Like, we're trying to get, when we've kind of tapped out on what we can do empirically using observations on what people do. So much of what we need to understand is about what people aren't doing. And we don't have the reasons of what people aren't doing, of why people aren't doing things, and we don't really know what people aren't doing because we can only perceive and observe what people do. So this is kind of a bit of a flip, and thinking about gaining all of that data to help us, again, refocus our attention on the needs of marginalized communities and on the needs of the transportation system to enable participation. One of the interesting things with the survey is we're doing it in collaboration with Statistics Canada, which will allow us to link our survey data to records that are held by the federal government. So those are things like tax records, immigration records, if they filled out the census and things like that, or the long form census. We'll be able to link in other sources of data and analyze in a secure lab. One of the things that we want to do with this data is define new standards that we want municipalities and authorities to adopt. And we want standards to be adopted that help ensure a more equal playing field in how easily different people can participate in daily activities. So we can think about this in terms of an accessibility standard. How much accessibility do we want governments to ensure is provided to all residents of a region? And we can think about, how would we set that accessibility level? How would we do that? One thing that we can do is look at the amount of activities completed as a function of accessibility. We can look at that amount of activities for different households, different types of households, low income or zero car households. We can also get more specific about the types of activities we're interested in. Is it, how easily people can get to job interviews, or how easily unemployed people can get to job interviews? Or we can look at that suppressed demand. How prevalent is a missed doctor's visit, as people live in lower levels or higher levels of accessibility. So given all of this data that's coming off of our survey, as well as travel surveys and things like that, we can start looking at making recommendations, like how much accessibility is needed in order to guarantee some amount of an equal playing field, providing kind of equal enough opportunity to different population groups, right? To eliminate that suppressed demand, or at least so that transportation is no longer the reason for that suppressed demand. So we're really thrilled about this as being kind of the Canadian, one day becoming like the Canadian version of those fairly weak, weaker standards in place in the US around proving that there's not discrimination or disparities, right? We actually want to say, no, how much is really needed to ensure that transportation is fulfilling that goal of providing opportunity to folks. The other thing that we can do with all of this is start incorporating this mentality into our business case analyses for transportation infrastructure projects. So this really picks up on my presentation. What we did with Metrolinx is we could think about a new project. This is a new subway project in the city. And we could think about, well, how much accessibility is set to, do we predict increases with this new project? How is that related to missed doctor's appointments? How is that related to employment outcomes? And can we start quantifying those social benefits as one of the returns in the investment in transportation? And I tell you, like, none of that stuff enters into the cost benefits analyses for transportation right now. Almost nowhere. It's all driven by travel time savings and greenhouse gas savings and carbon benefits and things like that. None of it is based on unlocking participation amongst people who are currently kind of not achieving their full potential in society because of barriers about the city that we've built around them. So we really want to also implement new practices here. And that's another piece of work that MJ is working on. The third is developing a set of pilots specifically geared towards solutions for marginalized communities. There's been so much focus on emerging mobility technologies, but very little emphasis on using these technologies to solve real problems. So let's start with the problem. One of our problems, for example, is this risk of transport poverty. Let's start with that as a problem statement and now say, can we test micromobility? Can we test new charging structures? Can we test, new programs in the transportation space that are specifically designed to improve the lives of marginalized communities, rather than say, let's just experiment with these technologies ad nauseum and then only afterwards find out, hey, who was excluded? Who were the real users? Is it just tech bros using these scooters, or is there a real place for e-scooters to serve the needs of immigrant women in poor suburbs? Let's start there and start with the community in need and really work on solutions. So that's what we're trying to do with our pilot programs. And we are doing this in partnership with the different organizations in our partnership. And we hope to have 8 pilots evaluated over the course of the next 5 years. Layered on top of these main activities, we've got cross-cutting themes. I'll go through this quickly, but we're looking at so much of the literature comes from the US, and the history of racism in the US around which population groups need to be prioritized when it comes to transportation. So how do we do that with a more local specificity? We're looking at different transportation modes, and we're looking at the planning process as well, and how we can develop guidelines that help transportation planners incorporate the needs of community in more equitable ways in their transportation planning processes. So with that, I'll end, and hopefully there's still about 10 minutes left for some questions. So thanks very much.
I didn't mean to shut you down by turning my camera on.
Oh, you totally did.
I know. I'm so sorry. But that's good, because we do leave about 10 minutes for questions, and we do have questions for you. Oh. I know Levi and I have questions, but we'll hold them just to make sure that we get through everyone else's. Sure. So Anastasia Sukov asks about your GTA case study. Is this discovered suppressed demand a hypothesis, or have you observed an increase in activity participation? That is, maybe a socioeconomic group who lives in the suburbs will always take fewer trips per day than the same socioeconomic groups in the urban area. And she says, very exciting.
Well, I mean, when it comes to income, we see we're comparing apples to apples on income level. And we have controls for age and, the household travel survey doesn't have a lot of control variables for sociodemographics. But
what about sorting? I mean, what if people who like to take trips locate themselves in parts of the city where they are able to take trips?
Yeah, there's a risk that self-selection is slightly biasing our results, but the truth is that low-income people are the people in the city with the least power to self-select and sort. And I don't think people are saying, hey, I don't want to be able to get to a doctor's office, and therefore I'm going to go live in a transit desert. I just don't think it's a plausible hypothesis in this case.
Yeah.
I know sorting matters in other cases. And we do have some longitudinal data that shows, say, in Eastern Toronto and Scarborough, over time, accessibility has dropped over time in Scarborough. And we see that corresponding with participation dropping as well. So there's some other research that does try to look at this longitudinally and at a finer scale. But Anastasia, does that get to your? Oh, she's not actually able to.
Yeah,
so
that's right. She'll be able to follow if she wants to. Yeah, I mean, while we're on the accessibility piece, I wondered, because this isn't my area of research, how much of it is cost and how much of it is like having the transit nearby?
So most of the research shows that that participation is, sorry, let me start again. I think both matter. And we clearly saw that income was an extremely important determinant of participation. Now, why does low income result in less participation? One reason is that it just costs money to do the things on the other sides of those trips.
Right.
Going shopping, seeing friends. Luckily, medicine is covered in Canada, but one thing is just, you need to spend money to be doing those things. And a smaller part of that is the friction of travel, right? And the cost, the financial costs of travel. For the most marginalized groups, the cost of transportation is known to be a serious impediment to participation.
Okay.
But outside of that, really low income strata, like the cost is not as important as, say, convenience and time and reliability and kind of the things that are associated with better levels of transit service provision. We're actually having a big political debate right now in Ontario. The Liberal Party, who's not in power, one of their policies is to make transit $1 a ride, $1 a ride, no matter who you are or where you're going, anywhere in Ontario. And there's a big question about, is making transit free for a person like me a good idea? For sure, there's folks who are choosing between bread and transit shouldn't be, should be made more affordable for those folks. But otherwise, I think the money needs to be spent on improving services, which is going to have a bigger return on investment than making it cheaper.
No, that's super. Ed Manley says, very interesting work. Thanks. Have you considered how this form of evaluation might manifest under new policies or investments, particularly how adverse outcomes might arise? For example, impact of downtown road space adjustments for trams or bike lanes negatively impacting lower income suburban car users?
I think that's something to keep track of, as when we're doing these analyses. What I showed you was just the benefits side, and there's also kind of the disproportionate impacts of costs, and absolutely that needs to enter into the that should enter into the equation for sure. It's not in my research right now.
Yeah.
But yeah.
He has a follow-up question too. He says, related to that, have you implemented this research within a transport model or agent-based model? And he says, that's a loaded question. We're building an ABM of Winnipeg at the moment and are interested in building in new approaches to evaluation.
Well, I think that's great. I'm not a agent-based modeler myself. And there's so much path dependency in those models, like they take decades to build. And the ones in our region don't have activity participation levels as something that's very sensitive to the environment. Okay, so yes, mode choice is sensitive to the relative cost of the different modes, right? But overall participation levels is kind of just being drawn. It's kind of predetermined in advance, and it's not sensitive to the land use and transportation system. So what that means is we, unfortunately, the way things are right now, we would have to kind of do a major revamp in order to make activity participation sensitive to environment, and it's not right now. So instead, can we take accessibility and kind of do some post hoc analysis on how that could impact participation, but then you're missing the feedbacks and everything else that's needed. So it's a big area, big open question mark. Good question, Ed.
Last question in the chat is from Emmanuel Trados, who says, very interesting stuff, Steve, thanks. Does the sigmoid model fit better to your data than the linear and quadratic ones? The interpretation certainly makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So we just tested goodness of fit using the standard statistics, and the sigmoid models for definitely for the full sample model, the sigmoid was more significant. And I think when we went down into the strata, I can't recall if we tested each specification in each of those 25 different subsamples. We might have just kind of said, okay, it's the most significant in the big sample, it matches with theory, and we decided to just impose it in our stratified models.
I want to make sure I leave time for Levi to ask a question if you've got one, Levi.
No, I mean, my interest was that kind of the theoretical implications of the different, model functions you're estimating. So, because they, despite the fact that the sigmoid does have a reasonable interpretation, it's imposing an interpretation unless it's kind of empirically justified. But no, I think we're good to go.
Yeah, and I see research still that doesn't. So a lot of the research just shows like a log relationship, because the diminishing returns is really easy to swallow, right? Yeah. I think what do we expect at the lowest end is a bit more contentious, and you'd think the answer to a transit desert, an absolute transit desert, is let's get transit there, but it might be that you don't see a huge change in behavior. You really need to do a huge investment to make transit attractive. So it does make sense, but I think this is one empirical case, and it's, we need to replicate this in other cases and test it out. And so I thought you were going to say that I needed to use geographically weighted probit models to do this.
Not quite.
Okay. I'm willing to go there with you, though.
If I could just slide in one last, maybe if it's going to open a can of worms, then we don't have to. But you talked mostly about transportation, but you had this sort of throwaway comment in the first half of your talk about retrofitting urban form.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious, like, what are you thinking? Like, what do we do? Yeah,
I mean, it's a big can of worms. You're right. But, in North America and most kind of elsewhere where we have automobile dependent urban forms, we don't really have a transportation problem. We have a land use problem.
Yeah. Yes.
So, we talk a lot about intensification. We talk a lot about infill. We talk a lot about deregulation of some post-war zoning that creates too much separation between residential land uses and commercial land uses. We talk a lot about that. That those are hard, long journeys ahead of us, right? I'll end with an anecdote because I have to run. But in Ontario, we lost a lot of our corner stores over the decades. A lot of our corner stores and our little kind of grocers and things got converted into residential uses. And in Montreal, that didn't happen. The corner stores and local retail kind of has been maintained. And I'm pretty sure it's because those stores are allowed to sell liquor in Montreal and not in Ontario, which makes them financially viable. So it's even this weird kind of thing around, okay, if we allowed corner stores and greengrocers to sell beer, it would be attractive for them to locate on smaller footprints embedded in neighborhoods, right? But we don't do that in Ontario. So there's all sorts of things, but I'll end with that one. We need better access to beer could be the thing that retrofits the suburbs in Canada. We'll see.
Super. And Anastasia had a follow-up. I'm not going to bring it up here, but maybe Anastasia can just get in touch with you directly with her.
Well, she's actually a PhD student on the Mobilizing Justice
okay,
project.
Good. Then I feel a little bit less concerned that I am closing us down right now, but I want to make sure that people can get out when they want to. Thank you everyone for joining us today for Steve Farber's talk. I do believe, Levi, that we have one more SAD seminar.
Indeed, yes, towards the end of May. So keep posted when that comes out. And it'll be Lindsay Conroe at the University of Auckland, I believe, talking about similar transit-related topics. So
great.
We'll post more information as it comes.
I'll try to come back to that one. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll see you later.